Welcome and thanks for joining for this week's short devotional. This week I'd like to take a moment to go through two different Psalms, Psalm 77 and 78. Back-to-back Psalms, same author. Asaph is the author of both of these. And I think Asaph has a lesson for us if we're willing to look at the text and walk away with some things that would speak to home life. For that reason, that's the title today, Home Life. Seems like a big subject matter piece, something that we find ourselves in Christian circles regularly talking about. Seems like all of the generations, a couple generations before us and the one that we're in now, seems to have everything from work to different programs and sports pulling away from home life. It's no longer that Rockefeller picture, if you will, right? That Leave It to Beaver type of family picture, if you will, this picturesque, ideal family that's out there pie in the sky. It's nothing like that. If anything, it seems like everything's pulling away from the family, detracting you from being with each other. And oftentimes, doesn't it seem even like perhaps these things are becoming priority over home life, family life, what things are supposed to look like? And it's also interesting to know that sometimes people say that home life is just merely being at home. But that's not it either. There's a description that God gives about home life, and it's incredibly valuable, and it does come with priority. It's a difficult subject because different people go about home life in different ways. But yet we should find some key things a part of home life. And for that reason, I want to dive into Psalm 77 and 78, and I want to look at a few different aspects. But to understand the setting of these two Psalms, the very first one, Psalm 77, is a psalm of lament. What we're going to find in Asaph is that he's going through a time of personal struggle, if you will. His soul just seems to be tormented. His mind is just hurting, his heart burdened. And so he's going to make those things very clear. I think sometimes as parents, we try to hide pain and things like that from our children. We try to shelter them from different things. One of the best things we can do as parents is actually travel through tough times with our children and help teach them in those times the importance of leaning on God. And I think that that's part of what Asaph's going to show us as we walk through today. So let's talk about home life as we go through, but let's start at the very beginning here. It starts out this way. For the choir director, according to Jeduthun, a psalm of Asaph. Now, we're not sure exactly what Jeduthun is. It seems like perhaps it's a form of a song that they had, but it was closely related to other laments. For example, Psalm 39 is a Jeduthun, according to the Jeduthun, and that's a psalm of David, and it's a lament psalm as well, where David is making known his heart and his pains. And so here Asaph is going to go into a lament, and it's going to be bearing some similarity to Psalm 39. But he starts out very uniquely. He says, "My voice rises to God, and I will cry aloud. My voice rises to God, and he will hear me." In my Bible, I have that phrase underlined. It's anytime that there's a promise of God, I love to underline it, highlight it, and go back to it, memorize it. Continue to have it on my mind, especially during difficult times. Asaph starts by declaring how he's going to go to God and how he's going to raise up his voice to God and remember that God does indeed hear him. Why? Because God is a living God. Well, who is this Asaph guy to begin with? Is he someone we should trust? Well, in 1 Chronicles, we learn that David actually appointed him to be one of the singers in the temple, meaning that if he was going to minister in that capacity, he was from the tribe of Levi. In addition to that, God saw fit to have him be a seer, a form of a prophet, if you will, in the Old Testament as well. And so a lot of the things that he writes have some prophetic aspect to them or statement of wisdom that seems to be from God. I would say that this seems to align. He says this in verse 2. "In the day of my trouble I sought the Lord. In the night my hand was stretched out without weariness. My soul refused to be comforted." What is he saying here? He's saying that his posture was that he sought the Lord in his troubles, and that throughout the entire course of the night, because his heart is so burdened, he constantly spent every aspect of that night in prayer before God. He could not go to sleep. He had to remain in prayer. There was a time several years ago in my life where this was a very similar setting for me. There was a very troubling time, a very troubling season going on. And it was very difficult to sleep, and I found myself constantly praying before God. But it's amazing at some of the things that happen when you just find yourself on your knees at home, praying and crying out to God, knowing that He does hear you, never doubting that, but always holding on to, my God lives, and I know He's hearing my cry, and He is very attentive to the afflictions of those that are His. He goes on in verses 3 through 10, and he begins to make many questions known to the audience. A lot of these questions I think we could probably relate to. For example, in verse 7, he says, will the Lord reject forever, and will He never be favorable again? He makes His mind known. I think we've been there. We've been at those points before. We're like, does God hear me? Does He know what's going on in my life? Will He answer? Will this struggle of mine, will it ever come to an end? Now, one of the things that's unique to know is that in this psalm, Psalm 77, Asaph doesn't have an answer yet from God. So he's asking these questions, he's making his heart known, but listen to the response that he gives starting in verse 11. Actually, let's go look at verse 10. Then I said, it is my grief that the right hand of the Most High has changed. Now verse 11. I shall remember the deeds of the Lord. Well, that's a good point. And I think it's something that I like to bring up often in our church. But there's two things that God told the Israelite nation to do in the book of Deuteronomy. And guess what? They didn't do them. The first one was to remember. And the second was to never forget. And again, we talk about this all the time, but to remember means to purposefully put on mind. And the second, to not forget, is to purpose to never have leave your mind. And so here, what is he doing? He's saying, I shall remember the deeds of the Lord. What is he doing? He's saying, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to recount the things that God has done. I'm going to have them purposefully put onto my mind. In my house, that means we open up Scripture and we say, God, remind me of the things that you've done throughout the course of history, namely in your word, so I can be reminded of what you can do still yet today. Then it goes on and he says, surely I will remember your wonders of old. I will meditate on all your work and muse on your deeds. He's saying, the first one, meditate, I'm going to just think on it. I'm going to constantly work it out in my mind. God, you did that. I cannot believe, wow, that's incredible what you did. And then when he's musing on it, it's like a form of chewing, right? When we say you got to chew on that, it's like a statement saying, think on it, dwell on it, really mull it over, if you will. Verse 13, your way, O God, is holy. What God is great like our God? This is now a response in his mind. He's saying, my mind has to be fixed on you, God. In all these trials, in all these struggles, everything that's going on, I want to remember you. And now in remembering you, God, I can see something. You're holy and you're good, and there is no God that's like you. You are the God who works wonders, is what Asaph goes on to say in verse 14. You have made known your strength among the peoples. And at this point, he then goes into a discourse, verses 15 through 20, and he begins to outline how Jacob and Joseph are mentioned and the bringing of the people out of Egypt, crossing the Red Sea. And that's what he describes. Listen to the way that he describes it, though. He doesn't say the Red Sea, but he does talk about leading through Moses and Aaron. Listen to verse 16. The waters saw you, O God. The waters saw you. They were in anguish. So this big sea, they see God because all creation declares the marvels of God. And the sea is in anguish over God. As powerful as water is, God is that much more powerful. The deeps also tremble. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth a sound. Your arrows flashed here and there. The sound of your thunder was in the whirlwind. The lightnings lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was in the sea, and your path in the mighty waters, and your footprints may not be known. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Now, this is generations before Asaph even lived that this stuff happened. And yet he's recounting something, specifically how all of creation obeys God and trembles at God because of his might, because of his power, because of his workings and his wonders of all different sorts. So really Psalm 77 we see the heart of a man who's struggling, but yet in his struggle, he finds rest and respite and comfort in knowing that God works even in the storms. God works. Now, how does this relate to home life? Well, that's where Psalm 78 comes in. See, Asaph wasn't there for the Red Sea. He probably wasn't there to actually witness the Red Sea crossing. It was in generations prior to him. So how does he know it like this? He's talking about it almost as if it's intimate to him, almost as if he was there. Well, let's go to Psalm 78. It's a maskil of Asaph. So now he's going to sing a song of direction, if you will, or instruction. He says, "Listen, O my people, to my instruction." And again, remember his role. His role was to lead in worship. He was to take Israel and to teach them through songs and praise. He was to direct their hearts to God, right, as they came into the temple. And on top of that, again, God's probably brought him in as a form of a seer or a prophet as well. And so a lot of the things he's speaking are really good wisdom for us. Listen to verse 1. "Listen, O my people, to my instruction. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth." He's saying, pay attention and pay attention closely. "I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us." Let's say this again. Which we have heard and known. Where? Where did we hear and where did we come to know these things? And our fathers have told us. Does that not speak to home life? Fathers, I am one. We're here as a role as fathers to have home life where we are directing our children and teaching them the things of old, the things that God has done. Not just in the Bible, but even in our lives. We're to open them up. One of the things that my daughters know is I want to talk through with them the difficulties of my life and not hide those difficulties from them. I want to make them very clear, actually, because in making them clear, I help them to understand how God answered, how God provided, how God brought me through different things. Not how I made it through, how God brought me through. And it's so important to have that time where we're talking through these things with our children. Asaph found it important. Listen to the next couple verses to find out how important. He said, "We will not conceal them from their children, but tell to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wondrous works that he has done." He's saying, we will not hide these from our children. We must not hide these things. "For he has established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers that they should teach them to their children." By the way, that's Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 to 9, is where that command is at. "That generation to come might know, even the children yet to be born," meaning we should be preparing our young men, our families, our children, that when they have children, they're ready to teach their children. "That they may arise and tell them to their children." Wow, now that's 4 generations that we're looking at now. "That they should put their confidence in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments." Do you see this? The point of walking through all of these things, all these wonders of old, and even exposing all the difficulties of our own life to our children, and walking through these things with them and letting them see how God provides, how God answers, how we can take an absolute comfort in them. All the different things that God has done, we can say, "God, blessed be your name." I think of Job as a great example. Job was wealthy, very wealthy. God takes everything away. His wife encourages him to blaspheme God. And what is his response in Job chapter 1, verse 21? "The Lord gave, and the Lord takes away. But blessed be the name of the Lord." And we learn how to trust God, and we tell our children all the time, you got to trust God, you got to trust God. But then they see you go through a difficult moment, and instead of letting them see how you walk through that, trusting God, we hide it from them. No, Scripture tells us, and Asaph is telling us, just as much as God is directed, no, we need to expose these things. right? We need to show them how God carries us through, why they can trust Him, and then demonstrate for them how they can trust Him. Verse 8, it goes on and says, and not be like their fathers, a stubborn and a rebellious generation. By the way, this stubborn and rebellious generation was known for something: not remembering and choosing to forget. They did not remember and they forgot. A generation that did not prepare its heart. That's what happens when you choose not to remember and you're allowing yourself to forget. You're allowing your heart to be prepared for things of evil rather than for things of good. And it goes and it ends this way in verse 8, and whose spirit was not faithful to God. I think each one of us that are here as adults, if you're listening in, we want our children to grow up well. We want them to grow up serving God, glorifying God, laughing and enjoying life all together. But if we're not willing to talk about how to walk through difficulty, trusting God, and really leaning on the promises of God and being comforted by all of who God is, then quite frankly, we're setting our children up for failure. And so when we think about home life, it isn't necessarily just a fight against the things of the world that can seem to take over, whether it be work or programs or sports or things like that. No. It's far greater than that. Rather, it's saying I need to designate time not just to be at home, not just to be around in general, but to purpose that time to say, this is a time, this is an opportunity for me to be used by God to press my children towards Him, for them to know that God is trustworthy, that He is good, that He is faithful and above all things, and we can rest in Him. It's a difficult subject, and I know we could talk about this quite a bit. But Asaph, as we saw in Psalm 77, was going through a very difficult season. And praise God, he had been taught as a child the things that God had done, the crossing of the Red Sea, how God had carried his family through, and because he was able to see that and he was raised up and taught those things, he knew he could trust in that God, and he began to see the comfort of God in his own life. That is so inspiring to me as a father, that I could leave my children saying, my daddy trusted in God, I heard what God did for him, maybe God can do that for me too. And maybe then we would see godly households being raised up where our children honor and glorify God even after they leave the home. What's your home life like? Are you making time specifically to see your children raised up in God, taught about all the things that God has done, both in the Bible and in your own personal life? I'd encourage you to take that time, structure it 3, 4, 5 nights a week. It's good to do every day of the week. But take that specific time and don't let other things come in and cloud it or take over it or even rip you away from that time. Make a set aside time where you're setting down, structured in home life, where you want your children to know what God has done through the course of history and in your life. I'm praying for you. I love you all. Enjoy the rest of the day. Bye.